right, so diving right into it. We're tackling Albert Camus' The Stranger today.
A deep dive into existentialism, you could say.
Exactly. Decades later. And this book still gets people talking,
Yeah, it's definitely one of those books that sticks with you.
So to really unpack this one, I think we got to go straight to the source, right?
Definitely. We're working with excerpts from The Stranger itself.
Using Matthew Ward's translation, just to be clear.
Right.
And I got to say, that opening line, it always throws me for a loop.
Oh, yeah.
Every time. Maman died today. Just like that. Bam.
No build-up, no fanfare. Camus doesn't mess around.
It's brutal, right?
Yeah.
And so matter of fact, like he's saying, this is life. Deal with it.
Exactly. And boom, just like that, we meet Mersault. Our protagonist. The protagonist might even be too strong of a word.
Yeah. He's not your typical hero, that's for sure. Not even sure hero is the right word.
He's different. Sees the world through a different lens.
That's one way to put it. I mean, he doesn't exactly come across as heartbroken, does he?
He processes things differently. Grief, emotions in general, not what you'd expect.
No, not at all. Camus really throws you off balance with Mersault, right? Makes you question everything you thought you knew about grief and how people are supposed to act.
Right from the start. You expect a certain reaction to a parent's death, and Mersault just doesn't give you that.
Yeah, it's almost like he's detached from it all. More interested in the coffee he's drinking or the sun on his skin than the fact that his mother's gone.
It's those sensory details, those physical sensations that seem to ground him, to anchor him to the world.
Like those are the only things that feel real to him.
And that, right there, that's classic absurdism. A core theme Camus is exploring throughout The Stranger.
This idea that life is inherently meaningless.
Exactly. There's no grand plan, no cosmic purpose.
Right.
It's up to us, to each individual, to create our own meaning.
So how does Mersault do that? Where does he find meaning, if not in the things we typically associate with it, like family or love or grief?
That's the question, isn't it? He's not searching for meaning in these grand, abstract ideas. He's finding it in the everyday, the tangible, the immediate experience of life.
The taste of that coffee, the warmth of the sun, those become his anchors in a world that otherwise feels adrift.
Precisely. He's present in those moments, those sensations. And in that presence, you could argue, he finds a kind of meaning, a way of navigating the absurdity of existence.
Which maybe explains why. Just a short time after his mother's funeral, he's going for a swim, starting a relationship with Marie, this woman he meets at the beach. It's like he's just moving through life, untethered from the weight of expectations.
He's not bound by the same social scripts, the same rules of mourning that dictate how we're supposed to behave in the face of loss.
And Marie, bless her heart, she's completely thrown by it. Can't quite wrap her head around his casualness, his seeming indifference.
Well, yeah. I mean, he shows up for their date still wearing his mourning band from the funeral.
It's almost comical, the disconnect between how he's acting and the situation he's in.
But that's Camus for you. He wants us to confront that disconnect, to question why we find it so jarring, so unsettling.
Like Mersault is somehow failing by not grieving the right way. Like there's a rule book for these things.
And because he doesn't fit the mold, he becomes an outsider, someone to be viewed with suspicion.
Which brings us to Raymond, this, shall we say, morally ambiguous character who enters Mersault's orbit. Talk about a contrast in personalities.
Right. Raymond is all passion, all consumed by this desire for revenge against his former mistress.
Whereas Mersault is
detached, observant, content to watch the drama unfold without getting too emotionally invested.
Even when he gets pulled into this revenge plot, even when he helps Raymond write that letter to lure the mistress back.
Which to most people would seem like a pretty cold and calculating move.
But Mersault, he's not thinking about right or wrong in the same way that most people do.
No, he's operating outside of those traditional moral boundaries. He observes, he participates, but he doesn't judge. He just is.
And that sets the stage for what's to come. The event that will change everything. The shooting.
Where Mersault's detachment, his inability or perhaps unwillingness to engage with the world on its own terms, collides head-on with the harsh reality of consequence.
So we're talking about a powder keg, right? All this tension, these simmering emotions, it's all there.
And the setting, Camus really ratchets things up in this section.
Oh, absolutely. Algiers, the heat, the sun, it's oppressive.
It's like you can feel it, the sweat, the tension, it's almost tangible.
Like the city itself is holding its breath.
And that beach house. Right, that's where it all comes to a head.
Yeah, that's the crucible.
That chance encounter on the beach, Mersault and Raymond running into those Arab men, including the brother of Raymond's ex-mistress.
Talk about a recipe for disaster.
It's like throwing gasoline on a fire, You can't help but feel like Something's got to give.
And then the shooting itself. It's described so vividly, but also with this strange detachment,
Well, it's all filtered through Mersault's perspective, right?
which just adds to the surrealness of it all. Like we're seeing this pivotal moment through a distorted lens.
Right. He's hyper-aware of his physical sensations, the heat, the sweat in his eyes.
That blinding glare of the sun.
And then when the Arab man pulls a knife, it creates this flash of light from Mersault.
What do you make of that? That detail always stuck with me.
Oh, it's loaded with symbolism, for sure. Some see it as a kind of break from reality.
Like in that moment, he becomes even more detached from what's happening.
Almost like he's outside of himself, watching this unfold from a distance.
And then he fires the gun. Just like that.
Almost mechanically, he describes it.
4 more shots after that first one. Like knocking 4 quick times on the door of unhappiness, he says.
Chilling, isn't it?
Absolutely. And with that act, Mersault's fate is sealed.
He's arrested, put on trial, imprisoned.
And throughout it all, that detachment, that inability to play the part that's expected of him, it never really goes away, does it?
No, it doesn't. And that's what makes this next part of the story so fascinating.
Because now he's facing the consequences.
Yeah.
But he still seems unable to grasp the gravity of what he's done.
The lawyer practically banging his head against the wall, trying to get Mersault to show some remorse, some understanding of the severity of his crime.
But he just can't or won't.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Is he even capable of experiencing those emotions in the way that society demands of him?
And of course, the prosecution seizes on this, paints him as a monster.
Cold, calculating, a man devoid of any moral compass. They use his own words against him, twist his actions to fit their narrative.
And it makes you think, doesn't it, about how quick we are to judge how other people grieve, how they process loss.
It's like there's only one right way to feel.
Exactly. And if you don't fit into that neat little box, then you're suspect.
Which is, of course, what Camus is getting at here. He's using Mersault as a lens to critique those very societal norms and expectations.
So Mersault is found guilty, sentenced to prison.
Yeah.
And it's in this confined, regimented environment that we see another side of his detachment.
How so?
Well, in a way, he finds a strange sort of freedom within the walls of the prison.
Freedom. In prison.
Yeah, it's ironic, isn't it? But he describes his cell as a kind of sanctuary, a place where he's free from the judgment and expectations of the outside world.
He compares it to living in a hollow tree trunk. Isolated, cut off, but in a way, at peace.
It's like the prison walls have become a kind of shield for him, protecting him from a world he no longer understands or wants to.
He retreats into himself, finds solace in his memories, in the minutiae of his daily routine.
He observes everything, fixates on the smallest details, and he sleeps. A lot.
A kind of escape, perhaps.
Maybe. Or maybe it's just another manifestation of his detachment, a way of coping with the absurdity of his situation.
And then there's that story he finds, that scrap of newspaper with the article about the Czechoslovakian man.
Oh yeah, that one's a doozy.
Murdered by his own mother and sister after returning home from years away.
Brutal. But Mersault, he becomes fixated on this story, reads it over and over again.
Almost as if he's trying to glean some deeper meaning from its absurdity.
Like he sees something of himself in that story, in the randomness and senselessness of it all.
And perhaps in that recognition, he starts to inch closer to that sense of gentle indifference that he'll eventually come to embrace.
The idea that the universe isn't malicious, it's not benevolent, it just is.
And in accepting that indifference, in letting go of the need to find meaning and purpose in everything, Mersault finds a kind of peace, a way of reconciling himself with the absurdity of his own existence.
Which brings us to those powerful encounters with the prison chaplain. Talk about a meeting of the minds, right?
Two very different perspectives on life, death, and the search for meaning.
It's almost heartbreaking, you know? The chaplain. He's so earnest in his attempts to offer Mersault some comfort.
Yeah, he really tries to reach him.
Hope for redemption, for salvation in the afterlife.
All the things someone in Mersault's position is supposed to be seeking.
But Mersault, he just shrugs it off, rejects it all.
He's not buying what the chaplain is selling.
It's like he's finally found his voice, but it's this voice of defiance, of anger even.
That scene where he finally cracks, rages against the absurdity of it all.
It's powerful stuff. Raw, honest.
He's rejecting everything, right? Society's expectations, the church's dogma, even those existential philosophies that try to find meaning in a meaningless existence.
And instead, he embraces what he calls the gentle indifference of the world. I mean, talk about a loaded phrase, right?
Yeah. It's Mersault's way of acknowledging the truth as he sees it, that the universe doesn't care about us one way or the other.
Not good, not bad, just Indifferent.
Exactly. And in that acceptance and letting go of the need to explain it all, to find some grand purpose, that's where he finds a kind of peace.
It's like he's saying, okay, so the world doesn't owe me anything. Fine, I can live with that.
And more than that, he can find a way to be okay within that reality, to find his own meaning, even if it's not the meaning that society tries to impose on him.
And that brings us to that final scene. Mersault on the brink of execution, and he's wishing for a crowd of hateful onlookers. It's so unexpected, so jarring.
Right, after this sense of peace he seems to have found, this acceptance.
Why do you think he does that?
It's his final act of defiance, I think. His way of sticking it to the world one last time.
He's refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break, of begging for forgiveness.
Exactly. He'd rather be hated for who he truly is than pitied for a performance he's not willing to give.
It's a powerful ending, that's for sure. So where does this leave us? What do you think Camus wants us to take away from Mersault's story?
I think he's challenging us to examine our own lives, our own search for meaning.
To question whether the meaning we find is truly our own, or if it's something we've adopted because it's what's expected of us.
Are we living authentically, or are we just playing a role, conforming to someone else's idea of who we should be?
It's a question worth asking ourselves, that's for sure.
And maybe, just maybe, there's a kind of freedom in embracing the absurd, in letting go of the need to explain everything and just being.
The Stranger, it's a book that stays with you, makes you think. And that's the mark of truly great literature, isn't it?
Absolutely. It sparks conversations, challenges our perspectives, and it doesn't give us easy answers. It leaves us with more questions than we started with.
And that's exactly what a deep dive like this should do. So thanks for joining us as we explored the world of Albert Camus' The Stranger. Keep those questions coming, and keep exploring the world of literature. That's what it's all about.